Hi folks, welcome to Set Apart Homestead. This is Travis. Today's video is kind of a recap a little bit on a video I made about 2 weeks ago, I guess. I'll see if I can leave a link to that video somewhere up on the top. Basically, it's talking about the Grand Solar Minimum. I've had a lot of feedback from you viewers on it, and people asking for a little bit more detail on maybe what it is and what's kind of going on. So I thought I would do another video doing just that. First of all, I'm not an expert on this. I don't have a science background. I'm kind of a amateur science geek, but it's not really something that I consider myself an expert in. There's some YouTube channels out there with people that are experts, and one of them is Ice Age Farmer. I will try to leave a link to his channel in the comments. This guy puts out a lot of information on the Grand Solar Minimum, on the crops, weathers, how the weather affects the crops and food supplies and stuff. So if you want to go check his channel out, I will leave a link to him. So this Grand Solar Minimum, I think there's a lot in the maybe more mainstream that's trying to push it off as just a kind of this conspiracy theory, and it's really not. That's the thing. It's very scientific. Our sun goes through stages, phases, ebbs and flows of solar output. And maximum solar output and minimum solar output, maximum sunspots, minimum sunspots, and there is a cycle, an 11-year cycle that the sun goes through, so that every 11 years it hits a maximum and then it hits a minimum, and it hits a maximum and hits a minimum, and this can be measured like clockwork, that it happens every so often. Those cycles, the minimums, meaning the minimum amount of like sunspots and solar activity, is less and less and less and less each time. And when that happens, we get to a point where it's called a grand solar minimum, where for a period of time, the solar sunspots, the solar activity minimizes. And during that time, typically our planet can go through a cooling period. It can last decades, and we have throughout history different mini ice age periods, what is typically called a mini ice age, and those are during those grand solar minimums. There's been a lot of hype over the last 2 or 3 decades of man-made global warming, of the greenhouse gas emissions and farting cows and the chemicals that we're spewing out that's causing these weather changes. Now, I'm not going to argue with the fact that we're polluting our planet, but the amount of it that is actually affecting our environment as weather patterns and stuff doesn't really look to be a lot. I would say that the biggest effect on our weather is, when it comes to man-made, is artificially manipulating the weather, which is a subject for another video. But that does happen. Our government does, and other governments, they do manipulate the weather. They really don't even deny that anymore. They used to, but now there's not really any denial of that. But anyways, that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. So we have this grand solar minimum. We've been getting into it the last couple of years, but it's kind of going to really get started in 2020 is what the scientists are saying, that by next year we will be in the full-blown grand solar minimum. They are saying that it will probably last for about 30 to 40 years, somewhere in the 2050s. We should start seeing it switch back to more of a maximum. So what does that mean for us? Well, for one thing, they're predicting that this could be a pretty big grand solar minimum, that the temperatures could drop back to where we saw in the 1600s, which was the last really big one. maybe even cooler than that. Anywhere between a 1 and a 6 degree drop, and that's Celsius, on the surface temperature, and that's actually quite significant. A lot of people are like, well, if it's 6 degrees cooler than it is now, you know, it's not a big deal. I don't think we're talking about temperatures so cold that people would just start, you know, freezing solid blocks of ice and dying. That's not what we're talking about. What we're worried about is that the temperatures will lower enough and the solar activity will lessen enough that it will interfere with our crops. It'll interfere with our food supply. Unlike how it's been throughout human history, current food production is very dependent upon a very finite system, that everything has to be just right and in place for it to work. And that's how we're able to produce large quantities of food. But it only works if everything is just right and just in place. There's very little diversity. We're very much a monoculture society where, you know, thousands and thousands of acres, whole states almost, produce only 1 or 2 crops. Whereas before, you know, each farm produced a, you know, very diverse amount of crops, and they provided for themselves and maybe sold at the local markets. And now you have, you know, a farm that's thousands of acres and it may only produce soybean or just soybean and corn or something like that. And if something happens that soybean, you know, they lose it and they have no crops, whereas before they might lose a few crops but the others survive because they're able to kind of make it through it. So it's actually a very fragile system that we have. And we're already seeing, we're not seeing so much in the stores, although there are reports this year in different places where stores were short on canned foods, you know, like green beans, certain canned vegetables. But I think that starting next year, we'll start seeing increased prices, and part of that is this year's just the planting was really bad. We had the flooding in the spring in 2019. This two springs floods were awful. A lot of these crops did not get planted for a month or more, sometimes 2 months after their normal planting time. Corn and soybean, things like that. Then you had you know, summer didn't quite work as well. It didn't get as warm as normal. And then we've had kind of a cool, wet fall. And so it hurt the harvest time. You know, a lot of these farms were getting snowed on before they were even able to harvest their crops. So the amount of food that was produced this year is much less. And so we'll start seeing that with the next cycle, which is next year, that, you know, crops are, you know, food prices are going to start going up. It's just a normal thing. It's just what happens. And so we're starting off the Grand Solar Minimum with an already kind of a low food supply because of the weather that we've had this past year and then last year also. So the main focus, the main problem with this Grand Solar Minimum is food. You know, yeah, you're probably going to maybe burn more fuel or use more fuel in the wintertime to keep your house warm, but you know, you're not going to freeze to death. We're not talking about a full-blown ice age, you know, where you see woolly mammoths frozen in solid blocks of ice. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about enough cooling of the Earth's temperature and enough reduction of the solar radiation that it's going to cause a difficulty for crops to fully develop and produce the amount that we're used to. There's just going to be less food produced. In fact, some of the predictions that I've seen are, you know, by the years between the year 2030 and the 2050, that we would not be able to actually produce enough food for everyone on the planet. So in a seasonal basis, an annual basis, we would not be able as a planet to produce enough food to feed everyone that's on the planet. And very much in part because of the Grand Solar Minimum. Also by then, you know, you're in the next, you know, 10 to 20 years, the amount of increase of population also would have to, you know, a lot to do with that number. So it's something to worry about. When you figure we've got this Grand Solar Minimum, we've got, you know, the political and civil unrest that's happening, the threats of civil war, because of, you know, elections, and then just the fighting between, you know, these political groups. You've got the financial markets and the just our entire financial system just on the brink of just complete collapse. You know, one guy was saying the other day, I saw he sent me that, you know, they're predicting in the next few years that gold could be as high as $4,000 an ounce. And what that means is it's not that gold value is increased, it's that our dollar value decreases. And a lot of people don't realize that. You know, they see that gold prices fluctuate and they're like, oh, gold's worth more, it's worth less. No, it's our dollar value that increases and decreases, and that's what affects the gold prices. So when you put that all together, I think that, you know, we're looking at the potential for a perfect storm. I've talked about that quite a bit lately. And it's, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I think it's something that we all need to be, you know, take quite serious. And it could have a lot of, you know, negative effects for us, for everyone. The ability to get enough food. I mean, that's a very serious thing. It's something that most everyone watching this channel have never experienced in their life. They've always been able to just go to the store and buy whatever food they want, however much they want. It's cheap enough. You know, you may not be walking around eating caviar and filet mignon, but hey, you know, food is cheap enough that everyone in America should be able to eat. That's going to change. Most likely that's going to change. And I think that that's something that most of us just really haven't put our heads around of what it's going to be like when we're not able to, you know, purchase the food that we actually need just to live because it's too expensive or it's just flat out not available. So while food is still cheap, we need to be, you know, preparing for that. We need to be buying our wheat berries and our grains of rice and beans and other spices and other freeze-dried foods. And, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff is quite cheap right now still. But I have a feeling that that's going to change. And I think this grand solar minimum is something that, you know, so many people just don't want to talk about. The science is out there. You know, again, I'm not the expert in that. I'm not the scientist, but I've watched the videos, I've read the articles and the reports, and you know, read the graphs and everything that these, you know, cosmologists and or cosmologist, whatever. Is that someone that puts makeup on? Maybe that's a cosmetologist. Anyways, you know, these scientists that are putting out this information, they're saying, hey, you know, this is happening. This is not an if, it's not a maybe, it's not one of those things, well, there's an asteroid that's coming so many million miles to the planet, you know, it could possibly hit us. This isn't one of those kind of things. It's in fact happening. And, you know, how bad it will get, that's the kind of still the uncertain thing. But the fact of it, whether it's going to happen or not, there's really not a, you know, that's not up for discussion anymore. We know for a fact it's happening. So we have to start, you know, preparing ourselves for that. You know, it could be this grand solar minimum, and this is kind of my thought on it, that this grand solar minimum could be kind of that needle that breaks the, you know, that straw that breaks the camel's back. Everything in our whole society right now is just kind of on edge. You know, everyone, you know, it's just on edge. Like, it's still civil. You know, things are getting worse, laws are getting worse, but it's still mostly civil. And then all of a sudden, if people aren't able to get the food that they want, they're not able to feed their bellies the way they like, they can't afford food, I think that could be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. And it could send us into a very chaotic period of our you know, in the future, in the very near future. So again, do some more research on your own. I wish I had more knowledge and more understanding. I mean, I feel I have enough for my own personal use, but I feel that you know, I'm not sure that I have enough knowledge to really be sharing all the details, because I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to put the wrong information out there for you. So, you know, this Ice Age Farmer, his YouTube channel, the guy seems really knowledgeable. I don't know him personally at all. I've watched his videos, and there's a few others. I'll try to leave some links to a few others that I found that seem to be pretty reputable on the information that they're putting out for this grand solar minimum. Anyways, start doing the research. This may need to be kind of moved up if it's not already. This grand solar minimum may need to be moved up in priority on your list of things to be preparing for, things to be watching for, because one thing's for sure, and there's been a lot of reports over the last few years of government and the ultra wealthy are buying up large amounts of food, large amounts of freeze-dried food, canned foods, and things like that. So, you know, maybe they're onto something, and I think that's very possible. What they're doing is they're buying up a lot of stuff like that because they see what's happening. It's a theory, but I think it's a pretty good one. Anyways, so that's kind of where I want to go with this. You know, I hope you understand a little more. It's basically, you know, to kind of wrap it up, the sun is going through a kind of a down period for a while. It's been that way for a few years, where the sun's kind of slowed down in its activity. It's, you know, the sunspots, there's less sunspots, which is part of what, you know, puts out so much, you know, radiation onto the planet, heats the planet, things like that. And it's going to affect temperatures, it's going to affect crops. There's also something that most people don't talk about. In a minimum, you would think it would be the other way around. You think it would be in a maximum, but in fact it's not. And during a minimum, a solar minimum, there's a highly increased odds of a CME, a coronal mass ejection, which is like an EMP on steroids. You know, the sun does a coronal mass ejection, and if it happens to be pointed at us instead of just out in space, it could knock us back to the Middle Ages. You know, it could potentially fry most electronics and computer electronics on this planet, or at least in the direction that it hits. So that's also another possibility during a solar minimum. Anyways, so start reading up. I encourage you, talk about it with your family, and get your food situation set up. If you grow your own food, which is really good, you might need to start looking into greenhouses, because it's very possible that it could cool enough that you wouldn't even be able to grow enough of your own food. If that's your plan, you know, not worry about buying, just growing your own food. Well, what are you going to do if the weather changes to the point that you're not able to grow enough of your own food? And I think that's where you should start looking into greenhouses, of building like large hoop houses to grow your food under, which possibly will increase extend your growing season, is what they're meant to do. All right, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.